Really, really grateful to all of them. We're going to start off this morning with a conversation with Craig Mundy, who is an old friend of mine, somebody I've interviewed many times when I was at Fortune. One time we had a little conflict because he said, sorry to remind you of this, Craig, but he said that said that I had not quoted him correctly when I quoted him calling open source socialism. And then we went back to the tape, and in fact he had. But anyway, those days are gone because now Microsoft even has a whole Hadoop thing, for those of you who know what that is. Craig, come on out. That's not what we're going to talk about. But you probably remember that, don't you? That was one of my more memorable recollections of my interactions with Craig Mundy, who's really been, Craig has been at Microsoft for more than 2 decades.
21 years.
21 years. When Bill Gates left, he took over a number of Bill's responsibilities and has recently spent, he was running Microsoft Research for a lot of recent years. He's been a huge policy advocate globally. I once went to China with him and spent a lot of time talking about what was happening in China, where meanwhile he was meeting with the senior leadership, which is something he has done in country after country. And I think it's one of the reasons this conversation is going to be meaty, is because Craig really does spend a lot of time talking to the leaders of the world about what's happening with the landscape of the internet and security and where it's headed. He is leaving Microsoft shortly. We'll see where he ends up. I'm sure it's going to stay deeply engaged with a lot of these issues of how we can really thrive in the internet landscape, given a lot of the uncertainties. My tea got left over here, excuse me. So I wanted you to start, Craig, with asking you, you were very eloquent as we were preparing for this about, that there's a sort of taxonomy that isn't understood by most leaders, even in the tech industry perhaps, but certainly in business and in government. And that you said that a lot of the language around sort of cybersecurity gets very muddied. Right. So how should we be thinking about that more clearly?
It's like everything else in tech, the challenges of cybersecurity or the issues around it have evolved fairly rapidly. And today I think they mirror the kind of problems that the world has had in the physical world for many, many years. But we got there fairly quickly. If you go back just a little more than 10 years, most of the stuff that was going on is in the first bucket, which I call malicious mischief. These were hackers and people who were sort of doing it for sport almost and notoriety. But today, I think that there's 5 major classes of cyber bad things going on, and I call them malicious mischief, crime, espionage, warfare, and terrorism. And of course, we know all those in the physical world, and now they're all present in the cyber environment. The thing that makes it a bit more complicated is in each of those categories, you now have to, in simple terms, think that there are 3 different kind of actors, which you could think of as saying that there's amateurs, professionals, and governments. And so right out of the chute, there's 15 different boxes. And each of them is different in its character, and each of them is going to be different, in my view, in terms of what we're going to have to do about it. And so when everybody puts everything under the banner of cybersecurity, it becomes something that's not actionable. And that's the problem we've had with policymakers, is they can't separate economic espionage from cyber terrorism, from warfare, and they're all very different.
So, is the bottom line, from your point of view, that it's really, really scary out there and we ought to be super worried?
Yes, we should be super worried.
Are you worried more than you were, say, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, about the risk of sort of this essential global utility, the infrastructure of the economics of the planet, the internet, becoming less usable and more in jeopardy in itself?
No, I'm not so much worried about the internet infrastructure itself, because all of the bad actors need that infrastructure to do whatever it is they're trying to do. The question is, what do they do with it now? My fears are not, in a sense, new or elevated beyond what they were a couple years ago. But I think that we're evolving now to the point where the last 12 months, for example, were really notable because a lot of the activities have shifted from the sort of mischievous category or the criminal category into the destructive category. And this is where you see the non-deterrable actor, for example, a terrorist organization or a nation state that's sort of more of a rogue relative to international order, who have decided that they're willing to use cyber means in order to seek retribution. So in August of 2012, the first really well-known now destructive cyber attack was launched. Many people believe it came from Iran, and it was targeted first at Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. And this is a nation state attacking a private business for the purposes of getting the attention of the other nation states' leaders. And in this case, they used not just cyber means. This is the difference between what I call the pros. That would be like organized crime is a pro, and governments. Governments have capabilities that they're willing to use that don't, they're just not available even to criminal organizations. And so they get into the organization, they plant malware that's destructive in nature, and on a Friday night, on a 3-day holiday weekend, they wiped out 30,000 computers. And for that company, it was a very long slog.
Saudi Aramco, yeah.
Saudi Aramco.
But I have a question. Why do you call that the first one instead of the U.S. And Israeli attack on Iran known as Stuxnet?
Because,
which was earlier.
Well, I don't know ultimately the origins of that. People attribute it to the U.S., but that was against a military target. And so the difference here is if you get a nation state essentially attacking soft targets, not military targets, that's a distinction.
So it's a landscape change,
right?
Regardless of what you think of Stuxnet, yeah.
Well, and you say
Stuxnet to me is a significant change
it was destructive
in the landscape also.
No, but
partly because we were caught. I mean, even if you don't agree, certainly it was. We were caught by the New York Times. Felt very strongly that they,
But I'm saying that, but whether you want to start with Stuxnet or then Saudi Aramco or Razgas or this year.
What was Razgas real quick?
Razgas, a week later in Saudi Arabia, the people who launched the one against Saudi Aramco watched how it got repaired in that first week, altered the malware to make it more completely destructive, and a week later launched it against the gas company in Saudi Arabia. So the two attacks were there. And then, you've seen this year things that are generally attributed to North Korea being, destructive attacks against South Korea. And so this, I think, is a very scary evolution because, you're starting to see people willing to deploy these things against what could become critical infrastructure.
Well, I think didn't Russia and Georgia get into a little of that too at one point, we think, most likely?
No, but again, that was essentially that was in the warfare category.
Yeah.
And there was essentially a hot war shooting, in kinetic terms.
Parallel to that, there was a cyber
What
attack.
they used is they used cyber to soften up or eliminate command and control capability.
Right, wow.
So the U.S., is the first country about a year and a half ago to make a formal doctrinal declaration that said they now consider cyber the fifth domain of warfare: land, sea, air, space, and cyber. And because of that, you just as in a kinetic war, you wouldn't say, well, look, I'll only use the Navy. Well, now people are saying, no, I won't only use the kinetic, or I won't only live in cyber. You blend them together. And so there's an arms race going on.
I mean, both in defining what is an attack and defining the proper response.
Correct.
Right.
So in a sense, the U.S. was starting to try to tell people, if you send me some bad packets, I might send you a cruise missile back. Because, I think in a naive way, many people were thinking of this cyber thing, it's over here, it's on the side. And if I do some bad things to you in cyberspace, you'll come back and do some bad things to me in cyberspace. And people are now beginning to realize that there is no clean dividing line between these two.
Okay, but as someone who is myself relentlessly determined to try to find the optimistic interpretation and to hope that the planet and mankind will move in a positive direction in terms of amity, you know, all the measures of health and wealth that I showed at the very outset, and the Gapminder info, et cetera. What can we do about it? Is there a positive scenario that you can envision where we will move towards a more protected, economically viable landscape?
Well, look, I mean, the viability of the internet in economic terms is a given in my mind. In fact, it's so given that it's why it's becoming a target for the people who want to disrupt these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So there's two things I think I'm hopeful we can see happen. One of the reasons I've created this simple taxonomy and try to explain it to policymakers around the world every chance I get is that I want to make it clear that in many cases, you know, in business you hear the terms now frenemies or co-opetition. And I think governments are now going to have a co-opetition because this technology is now pervasive in virtually every society. And therefore, no society can afford, just like they can't afford to turn off electricity or running water, they can't turn off this anymore.
Right.
And so even if you have differences of opinion, or even, you know, pretty serious conflict in some traditional sense, you may find that you have a common cause against cyber terrorists. And so, for example, it doesn't matter which country you're in, if a terrorist organization was able to substantially disrupt the global banking system, there is no country that is immune from the side effects. All right? And so, you know, you can say, well, we may be, you know, annoyed about other things, but man, if we see these guys over here messing around with the global banking system, we better get on it and get on it together. And so I'm trying to help people understand that there may be certain things that we have common cause across many nations, and that we need to find a way to have those countries and their capabilities cooperate in both deterring and addressing, or even, you know, fighting back, if you will, when you have those kind of actors. And then the second thing I think we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do some tune-up, you know, on the technology of the internet.
Right. I want to get to that. Yeah.
And both are going to be required.
And so, talk just quickly on both of those points. Do you see progress? I mean, given all your conversations with global leaders, is that message starting to get through? And what, and the second point, is the method that you think we ought to move toward to address some of these?
On the first part, it's, I'll say, the earliest days. I mean, this taxonomy that I described today, you know, we only invented in the last few months in order to try to give clarity to these discussions, largely because every time I tried to have a discussion, or you even watch governments try to have these discussions. You know, you look at the U.S. and China. It's in a different case, but you know, a year ago, no one actually had a clear definition of economic espionage. But you know, as we've given clarity to that, the U.S. President Obama and you know, when they had the Sunnylands meeting with President Xi, you know, that went to almost the top of the president's agenda because there's this asymmetric issue between the two countries with respect to economic espionage.
Of course, it was so interesting since it was 2 days after the Snowden information was released, and the timing of that was awfully interesting. Yeah.
But yes, and what was unfortunate in many senses is just as the two governments were actually starting to understand a little bit about, oh, this economic espionage is a real problem for the U.S. at least, when the Snowden leaks happened, the Chinese side broadly in the media said, well, you see, you're spying on us too.
Well, I'm sure that's what Xi said to Obama also. I mean,
right, but the problem is that, you know, governments have spied on each other for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, all right? My view, that's not going to go away. No matter what, government to government espionage is not going away. On the other hand, almost all governments have sworn off of this idea that governments should steal business, you know, assets for the purposes of advancing their own businesses.
Yeah.
Okay? Right now, there's still some countries that are practicing that. And so,
notably,
well, I mean, you know, the ones that are popularly believed to do that, China, France.
Do you believe that China's doing it?
Yeah, yes. Well, what I've said to the Chinese leaders, point blank range, is the United States has caught somebody in China with their hand in the cookie jar relative to stealing business assets broadly.
And then giving them to Chinese.
And giving them to Chinese businesses. And so that in my view, is not a disputable fact now. The Chinese leaders at the very top level say, it is not our policy to do that. And so what I've pointed out to them is I said, well, we have seen in other countries where the government employees who by day are part of the espionage and surveillance business, by night serve criminal interests from the same desk and the same computer. And we've seen that in other countries. So I said, you could tell me that your guys have gone rogue, and at night, the same people in that military, building are basically stealing this for economic purposes, and it isn't your policy. But our position is, we don't care whether it's crime or policy, make it go away. Mm-hmm. All right? And this, I think, is the kind of candid conversation that has to happen, and it has to be focused around these very narrow issues.
So you see some progress on that?
I see progress only insofar as there actually is a discussion going on.
Okay.
And until the last few months, there really wasn't.
I want to go to the second point, because I know you have very clear and strong views about what kind of technology changes and behavioral changes maybe we can implement to address a significant portion of the taxonomy that you're describing.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the biggest problems in all of this, just take for a moment, I'll call it the non-deterrable actor, the real terrorist organization. You ultimately have to deal with those too. But if you want the rest of the functions to work better, we have to have much better identity. And not just for people. We have to have identity for computers, the physical devices, for the programs that run on those computers, for people, and for people, we also have to have roles.
So by identity, you mean, uncontroversially labeled and how would you define it? Just so that there's absolutely no doubt that that machine is that machine, and we can identify who owns it or who has the rights to use it, and same with that application, same with that person.
Right. So, we've started down this path quite a long time ago. The TPM hardware, which is a trusted program module, it is a hardware root of trust. And we've been gradually getting it put in more and more devices.
We being who?
We being the industry.
Yeah.
Microsoft in particular has been a big advocate for this. I think we helped push it over the top in the last couple years on the PC side, because we required it for every new machine that would run Windows 8 or beyond. Depends on having this hardware root of trust. From that, you not only know that the machine is there, but these hardware roots of trust actually allow you to then have what's called a secure boot. And that means that you can validate the bits of the operating system that gets loaded. From that, you can work your way up the software stack, knowing with some certainty, the origin and integrity of every piece of software in the system. And ultimately, everybody's going to have to do that. This year, a number of companies, I think notably Microsoft, Google, and Apple, all got together to some extent and said, we should ask all the phone manufacturers, to do the same thing, because as the world moves to mobile, unfortunately, the phones that everybody carries around with them are about a decade behind right now from the personal computers in terms of how well they're engineered with respect to these kind of security mechanisms.
And identity of the device in particular?
Yeah, and the mechanism to allow you to have a trusted boot for the software and to basically hold credentials for people or for programs with high integrity.
But just to summarize, so the point of identity is so then you have a rights-based architecture where you really know which machines and applications have the right to what information at what time, et cetera, and what people on the other identity side?
Well,
is that the right way to think of it?
Well, I think there's two separate problems. The first is independent of whether you're trying to get to the rights question. That's sort of a thing I've been talking about for the privacy problem, all right, which is a related issue. But I think whether you're worried about the privacy problem or not, you still are going to have to be able to trust these computers. And so, and this leads to the behavioral or operational changes. Today, everybody just has their big computer network in their enterprise, if you will. They usually have a uniform set of credentials which they use to access everything. They rely on access control lists, in the operating systems in order to be able to decide, that David can see this file and Craig can't see this file. But those mechanisms, in my view, are not strong enough, in part because they don't start with a robust identity mechanism in every case, and in part because a lot of these things were engineered at a time where the threats were not as high as they are today. Unfortunately, many organizations don't actually keep upgrading their software, to new versions. And one of the problems with that is that software advances. And even if you said, hey, its functions are only the same as the last one that I used, I don't need the new functions, that's fine, but you need the new underlying security mechanisms because the bad guys' weapon systems have been evolving.
It's that classic arms race.
It's a classic arms race. But right now, most organizations are not really thinking about it that way.
Even still.
Even still. Well, I mean, look at this year, we're finally going to retire Windows XP. It's 14 years old. It is completely, I'll say, unprotectable relative to contemporary threats. And we still, have hundreds of millions of machines still running it. And, people fight with us to say, but I want to keep it. And we say, we can't in conscience do this. If you're an enterprise and you have one such machine on your corporate network, that will be the point of entry for the bad guy.
Wow. This is so good. There's so much to say, but we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to let the audience get in. Is there any fundamental point you wanted to make that I haven't let you make before and if you can articulate it as quickly as possible? Because but I do want to see what people have to add. Let's see who has a comment or a question. I can certainly, let me just ask you one while we're seeing if anybody's awake enough to ask one. At the base of all this thinking, from your point of view, do you see that things are more or less likely? I mean, you sort of said you didn't think it was much worse earlier in the conversation, but on the phone you sounded a little different. More or less likely to spin out of control or be able to put a lid on it today compared to the past?
Well, I think the risks are substantially higher, and the reason is that the problems are escalating faster than the mechanisms to deal with them.
In general.
And one of the things people don't understand about, I'll say, these cyber sort of weapons of mass disruption. Everybody thinks about WMD as mass destruction, but these things are really mass disruption. And the thing that is, for me, scary about them is that, let's say somebody has a really sophisticated, weaponized, mechanism to use malware to mess around with banks or the power grid or something. In the internet, things can happen so fast at such high scale that I believe no country has really prepared itself to be able to deal with a disruption that affects the entire country at once. If you think of even biological weapons or nuclear weapons, other than in a holocaustic kind of scenario of the Cold War, today we worry that a terrorist might get a nuke to go off in one city. And that would be a huge problem, obviously, but it would only be one city. But if somebody had the equivalent, capability in cyber, and where they figured it all out and could turn off a substantial percentage of the power grid in the United States. I mean, look, power grids cascade into failure on natural terms, and we keep working to try to make them better. But let's just say that somebody figured out a cyber means to cause one of these cascades, and it affected the whole country. How does the country bootstrap itself back into operation when there's no part of the country that's running? and even weathers and things like Sandy, affect one part of the country. Big weather systems affect one part of the country.
Yeah.
You don't get the whole country.
Okay.
And so these are scary.
It does sound scary. Okay, if Dan Elron has a question, I want to hear it. And you don't need to identify yourself because he's Dan Elron from Accenture. So we've only got a minute, but I really want to hear it.
Thank you. It's relatively early days for the Internet of Things. Utilities are numbered and we know who they are, but pretty soon we'll have these smart devices in every home, car, bridge, etc. So should we do something different before we unleash this Internet of Things in terms of protecting ourselves based on the lessons from the PC world?
Yeah, I mean, when that panel was talking yesterday, I wanted to intervene and decided there wasn't time, but I would plead with the people that are doing the Internet of Things to recognize that they should start at least equivalent to what we've been able to put into PCs and are now putting into phones. But because they're all trying to reduce the cost to zero, there's no focus. It's just exactly what happened to mobile phones. Everybody wanted to be cheap as possible, so they wouldn't add a penny or two, to basically add these capabilities. And the engineering from a software point of view is not being done with any eye toward these kind of issues. So yes, I think with the Internet of Things coming on and at least 700 companies getting together to ponder this, they should start and decide. Because I can tell you, because Microsoft of necessity lived through this 10, 12 years ago, and even today, when you design without the idea that these things are all connected and there's bad guys, you just do not put the level of in-depth design and testing into these things that you have to have. And so, Bill and I started the trustworthy computing thing at Microsoft 12 years ago, and we've changed the whole company's engineering practice over the course of a decade in order to make these things better and better. And I would tell you that, almost no organization has made a similar investment, and almost none of the people that are assembling all these piece parts for the Internet of Things are making a similar investment. And I think that that's a recipe for disaster.
Well, on that cheery thought, I love listening to you talk about it, although I wish we had more time because there's so many questions that this raises about the future of human society to me, but in which we were kind of getting at the World Economic Forum session earlier. It's so great to have you here and your experience explaining some of this stuff to us. So thank you, Craig.
Absolutely, thank you.